drone warfare and evolving tactics of the Ukrainian forces have rendered Russian armored columns and maneuver warfare pretty much ineffective. Most fighting now has gone down to infantry combat. Every time the Russians try to use an armored column advance, they're slaughtered. And it seems very unlikely at this point that Russia will be able to stage another large-scale offensive.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Jeff Hawn from the London School of Economics. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Over the past few days, we've seen Ukraine back on the advance in the Kursk salient. However, these are only small advances. Are Ukraine still set on holding this area of Russian territory?
I believe they are. It makes sense from both a strategic and a political standpoint. The Institute for the Study of War, which probably has the best analysis of the day-to-day happenings in the conflict, estimates that as many as 78,000 Russian soldiers are tied down in the Kursk region. Even with the massive damage done to the Russian military conventional formations, that's a significant amount of manpower that is not being used to attack Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have deployed a sizable number of troops numbering roughly 20 to 30,000, mainly made up of elite formations, but they're able to hold on to this territory and, as we've been seeing in the last couple of days, launch small continuous advances. From a political situation, this helps to undermine the Russian regime because it's occupation of their own territory, which shows that Russia is not immune to counterattack from the Ukrainians, and any potential peace settlement, this will be a very valuable bargaining chip for the Ukrainians to regain control of aspects of their territory.
And so what does this say about Russia's efforts to eject Ukrainian forces from Russia?
Well, it just shows the general impotence of the Russian military at this point. Now, the Russian military at the start of the war was probably in the best shape it had been since the 1980s. But even then, we saw that they struggled with large-scale maneuvers in the face of new technologies, particularly first-person drones. But more startling was the Russians' inability to effectively supply their forces and launch large-scale maneuvers. As a result, the Russians have basically been reduced to small-scale trench warfare, relying on units sometimes in the company or platoon size of a few dozen to a few hundred to make very small advances. But they're also not able to advance on a wide front, having to devote resources to certain sectors where they make progress. So they're not able to regain their territory in Kursk and continue advances in the sections of Ukraine where they've been on the attack. And it's telling that the Russian regime has prioritized continuing its grinding offensive in Ukraine over regaining its own territory.
And we've heard this week from Ukraine that North Korean troops fighting in Kursk have allegedly all but left the front lines. Are they likely to return, or are they just going to be, put into rearguard positions?
It's unclear because the political discussions between Russia and the DPRK are extremely closed, and we have very little insight into DPRK domestic politics. It is interesting that Russia was able to secure direct intervention from their North Korean partners in order to offset their manpower shortages. However, the North Korean troops have found the environment to be just as devastating and difficult as the Russian forces did, and have, as a result, suffered very high casualties. Now, it's unclear if they've been rotated back into the front line or if they've been rotated out, if they'll be reinforced or if they'll be withdrawn. No, but regardless, it does not appear that they have made a significant impact on the battlefield, in that even with the deployment of North Korean forces, Russia has continued to keep several of its better units, especially its marine and airborne forces, in Kursk, but they've also continued to be ineffective at regaining territory, and as we've seen, have now again lost ground.
And North Korea have this week essentially admitted that they are in Russia after a long while of the Russians saying that these troops were actually just from Eastern Russia or from Siberia. I wonder why now the North Koreans have decided to admit that their troops are in Russia fighting against Ukraine. Is there a sense they maybe feel that they've got away with it because the international community hasn't brought in any extra sanctions? People had maybe expected South Korea to have upped its support for Ukraine. Do they feel that there wasn't enough of a reaction, and so now they feel comfortable letting everyone know?
Well, it's all speculation because, again, the DPRK is such a closed box and it's difficult to ascertain what's going on within it. But some of the experts on North Korea I've talked to have suggested that this might actually, admitting their involvement in the war, might actually be a signal to the White House and the Trump administration, which, as we remember from the previous Trump administration, was very willing to engage with North Korea on a level that other American administrations had just absolutely refused to. And now that they've admitted official involvement, they essentially might try to inject themselves into any kind of peace negotiations and gain some kind of concession from the US in exchange for withdrawing their forces, or part of the broader peace deal, try to pressure Russia to make concessions to North Korea, part of the overall peace plan, ceasefire, peace deal. However, that said, a peace deal is not a foregone conclusion, and ultimately the Russian regime is the one who remains the most obstinate and unwilling to talk.
And do you think that was part of Pyongyang's planning for this the whole time, or is this just a case of maybe opportunism?
I think it's opportunism. I think the deployment of the forces was opportunism. I think selling military systems to Russia was opportunism. The DPRK is a very isolated regime. It basically takes any opportunity it can get because the Russians in such a vulnerable position with their own resources stretched to the limit to have been forced to make very large concessions to the DPRK. And in exchange, the DPRK has essentially given up very little. The 10,000 men it's deployed is a small fraction of their overall military. And the amount of weapons they've sold off have essentially just been sitting, gathering dust in warehouses throughout North Korea for years. So it makes perfect sense for them to trade on the only thing they really produce of export that's any value, which is their military.
Naturally, Kiev have been pretty secretive about what their actual solid objectives are in Kursk, but what has the impact been on the wider war?
Well, the impact has been fairly significant. First of all, it's tied down a large portion of Russian forces, which has delayed Russian advances in other sectors. Two, it has given the Ukrainians the ability to continue to build their own experience with offensive operations. And three, it has served as a valuable political tool. It's much easier to force concessions from an opponent when you control a portion of their territory. Now, that said, it probably hasn't achieved everything that they hoped that it would achieve. And it's interesting that the Russian regime has continued to prioritize their own offensive operations in Ukraine. It's also important to note that though the Ukrainian forces are facing severe difficulties, especially in shortages of manpower, equipment, and low morale, Russian advances are often exaggerated in the press. If we actually look at the amount of ground gained, the scale is very similar to the First World War, where Russia is celebrating advances measured in the hundreds of meters, if they even get that far. Sometimes it's just mere dozens or even just one street over. So it is a very grinding, slow offensive. And because of the significant damage done to the Russian military by Ukrainian deep strikes and drones, it's unlikely that we'll see a breakthrough at any point in the future. And even if there is a breakthrough, it's unlikely the Russians at this point would be able to exploit it.
And as you said before, it seems that Ukraine believe that the salient in Kursk could be used as a bargaining chip in any possible talks. But the area that is held in Kursk is now much smaller than it was in August. Is it still significant enough to use in possible negotiations?
Yes, it is the short answer, because for the Russian regime, it's unacceptable that even 1 square inch of their own territory is occupied by a foreign power. And of course, Ukraine has flirted with setting up a separate government in Kursk, a breakaway or secessionist government, which strikes at the very heart of the Russian regime, which since the 1990s and the Chechen Wars continues to see secessionism as its number one threat. There's some argument to be made that the central motivating factor behind this war in the first place is the inability of Putin and his regime, or largely just Putin himself, to accept Ukraine's full sovereignty as a separate state.
And how important is it for Ukraine to prove that they're still capable of that sort of rapid maneuver warfare that we saw in Kursk earlier in the summer?
Well, it's important in order to illustrate that they can continue to stay in the fight. Ukraine's military has been struggling largely because they are not coordinating their forces on the battlefield very effectively. While a brigade holds in one sector, they'll be pushed back in another, forcing withdrawals to unprepared positions. This is one of the reasons why we saw Ukraine reform to a corps system to try to better coordinate large scale operations. But they do have to show that they still have offensive punch, largely to demonstrate to the Western donors that the systems they've been donating or sending have not gone to waste and that Ukraine is remaining in the fight. That said, it's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to launch a large scale counteroffensive in its own territory for the foreseeable future because even with all of the problems Russia has with its own shortages of equipment and manpower, Ukraine has the same problems, but also a much shallower pool of reserves to draw from.
And Ukraine have also taken to destroying a lot of Russian command posts as part of their Kursk strategy. Another strike carried out that we saw just last week. What sort of impact is that going to have on Russia's offensive capabilities in Kursk?
Well, it's essentially the same impact we've been seeing across the front line, where Russia's command and control has largely degraded to the point where they are struggling to coordinate large scale operations really above battalion size. It's very small, targeted advances, usually made by a few hundred to a few thousand men, normally shock troops, penal battalions called Strafbats, contractors who are really just paramilitaries at this point. But yeah, Russia really is a paper army at this point. It continues to use designations of combined arms army and different divisions and regiments. But according to military analysts and ISW, some of these large Russian formations that are supposed to number a few thousand men now number a few hundred, if that many. It's very much a hollowed out force. And with that, higher level command and control has largely broken down. And as Ukraine continues to strike those, it makes it more difficult for the Russians to reestablish those networks, especially as senior officers are hesitant to put themselves in the crosshairs.
And we spoke earlier about the impact on Russia's offensives elsewhere in Ukraine. We know that Russia are continuing to advance on key towns in the Donbas, such as Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. But has the offensive in Kursk taken pressure off other areas in Ukraine, and which ones specifically?
To some degree, the Russian offensives continue to mainly be focused in the Donetsk region, where they're continuing to try to regain control of the full obelisk. They've largely gone over to the defensive in other sectors. Kursk has had an impact in that it has drawn off Russian forces, but it's also illustrated the Russians can really only maintain offensive tempo in one sector at a time. They have to feed all their reinforcements and equipment into those sectors in order to keep up the advance, which, as I pointed out earlier, is incredibly slow and comes at a massive cost in casualties. Estimates at this point put Russian casualties well into 250,000 dead, and then many more that number wounded. And those numbers only continue to grow. Unfortunately, Russia does have a large supply of manpower, but as we've seen, they've also embraced an all source strategy to get manpower from wherever they can, even deceiving people from India into being conscripted into their military. So their supply is not limited, but they continue to spend as many lives as they feel they want to on these offensives, which gain a few hundred meters at a time and really have no strategic effect on the broader conflict other than to continue to run up the tally of dead and wounded.
And Russia, of course, had their own incursion into northern Ukraine towards Kharkiv in May. Ukraine also claimed that there was another plan for the Russians to advance on Sumy. How does Russia's capability to stage their own incursions into other areas in Ukraine across the border compare with Ukraine's?
I think Russia's in a much worse position to stage those because, as I've said, they're trying to maintain their offensive operations in the Donetsk region. Uh, Essentially, drone warfare and evolving tactics of the Ukrainian forces have rendered Russian armored columns and maneuver warfare pretty much ineffective. Most fighting now has gone down to infantry combat. Every time the Russians try to use an armored column advance, they're slaughtered. Um, and it seems very unlikely at this point that Russia will be able to stage another large scale offensive. There's renewed rumors that they're trying to reopen the Belarusian front, which has largely gone quiet since Russia retreated back into Belarus, and to bring the Belarusian military into it. Whether that would have any kind of impact is incredibly unclear because the Belarusian military largely exists on paper. Um, so Russia will continue to try to open new fronts and find weakness in the Ukrainian armor, and they will continue to, unfortunately, make advances, but at a glacial pace.
And you talk about those advances. I mean, a lot is being made of Russia's advances around Pokrovsk. If Pokrovsk were to fall, to be seized, I mean, Toretsk fell only in the last few days, according to Russian sources, but it certainly is a struggling part of the front. If somewhere like Pokrovsk fell, there's a lot of flat land on the other side of that line. Ukraine may have to withdraw. Could we see Russia making a larger advance, or are they simply not able to make those sort of rapid maneuver warfare advances at this point in the war?
So when the war first began, or when the war first escalated back in 2022, we all remember that Russian armored column, which became strung out and stuck trying to advance on Kiev. That was when they were at the height of their logistical capability. Even if Petrovsk falls and the Russians make it onto flat land, they just make themselves better targets for Ukrainian artillery and drones. They don't have the logistical capability, and they no longer have the military formations capable of rapid breakthrough advances. It would be possible to construct formations to do that, but that would require a complete retooling of the Russian military that they simply do not have the time, resources, or capability to do, while the majority of their forces are basically bogged down in this long running conflict. So, if this town in Ukraine falls, then the center of the conflict just becomes the next defensible position. It really is very much like Passchendaele back during the First World War. It's a strategic and tactical quagmire, and there's no industrial might from a new competitor that's going to come online that's going to ultimately break the stalemate. Russia just is continuing to degrade its capabilities the more it carries on these offensive operations, which is why it seems likely that the war will come to some sort of conclusion due to mutual exhaustion. But as I've pointed out, the Russian regime is very isolated from the reality of the situation, and whether or not they're willing to actually talk is questionable. And then one of the biggest problems in the conflict right now is Russia, even more than previously, does not accept Ukraine's sovereignty or Ukraine's ability to negotiate for itself. They're insisting on talking directly to the United States. And there's very little the United States can do at this point to, now that they've largely frozen aid or have been freezing aid, which, while yes, that degrades Ukraine's combat capabilities, it does not prevent the Ukrainians from resisting, which they will continue to do until they're able to get some sort of agreement that they feel will at least allow them the breathing space so to invest in their own security.
And we're talking now, of course, about these negotiations for a ceasefire that the new American administration certainly believes are still possible. Trump said on Friday that he had another phone call with Putin. Interestingly, this time round, the Kremlin did not deny that had happened. Where does that leave the possibility of negotiations? And do they? I mean, you say they can't be conducted between the Americans and the Russians. Are Ukraine sounding willing at this point to come in as well?
Ukraine's been engaged in talks since before the war escalated, and then has continued to maintain a dialogue. That's how we've seen the prisoner exchanges. But they're starting from fundamentally different places. Ukraine maintains, which is the truth of the matter, it is a sovereign independent state that should be negotiated with as a sovereign independent state. Putin and his closest advisors seem to believe that Ukraine is just a puppet of the United States. So they want to deal directly with the US. They don't even want Ukraine involved in the negotiations. It's that level of disconnect from reality that is really hampering any kind of constructive dialogue or ceasefire talks. Now, the US, nobody knows what they're going to do at this point because the current American administration has a very creative interpretation of reality as well. But they could cut off aid, which they've largely already done. The European nations will then be under pressure to step up aid, which they've already begun to do. But then, short of imposing sanctions on Ukraine, which seems incredibly unlikely, as it would be serving in Russia's interest, which even the most ardent, American right winger will not go for, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, but it seems unlikely there's much pressure the U.S. can bring now that aid has already been now frozen. And it's worth noting that the Ukrainian government is not sitting idly by. They recognize the American administration, or this American administration, is very transactional in its nature. So Zelensky has already proposed to Trump some sort of new rare earth minerals development deal or economic investment. I mean, to be frank, I think we're pretty close to them just finding the biggest hotel in Kiev and renaming it Trump Tower in order to get his support. I mean, I don't know if they'll seriously do that, but I'm sure it's been talked about. But that will continue to be a way for them to try to elicit more support from the U.S., which during the Trump administration they did maintain levels of support, and so we'll see how we'll see how this progresses. But yeah, at this point, I don't think a ceasefire negotiation is plausible in the near term. But with these actors having as much control as they do, such as Putin, if he decides one day that, yes, I want to stop the fighting, then that could open the door to at least a ceasefire.
And the Munich Security Conference begins next week, in the coming week. What are Ukraine going to be hoping to see from that?
What they'll be hoping to see is that the European partners, recognizing the threat to their own security, step up their contributions to offset the withdrawal of U.S. aid, at least at a level that will allow Ukraine to continue to defend itself at an adequate level and continue its limited counterattacks. It seems very unlikely at this point that Ukraine will be able to put together forces to stage a large-scale counteroffensive. But if they can continue to stage these small-scale attacks like we've seen in Kursk or counterattacks we've seen elsewhere on the front lines, hopefully that will force the Russians to the negotiating table. But that will rely on the European states coming to the conclusion that Ukrainian security continues to be in their own interest. We do see elections coming up, especially in Germany, where pro-Russian parties are continuing to gain on the back of other issues that Russia has aligned itself with. So the ultimate outcome is in doubt, but it does seem likely that the European countries will take Ukraine's continued security seriously.
Jeff Hawn, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.